Good morning, everybody. It's 10 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you guys all for joining us this morning. This is our first TA chat of the new year and the first of our Tier 2 Tuesday series. And so you're going to be hearing from Brooke Curtis from our project today. She's going to be kicking us off with the Tier 2 series. And I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Brooke.
Thank you, Betsy. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm going to start pulling my screen up here real quick as we get started. But if you would, in the chat box, let me know, or let all of us know, if you are here as a district level personnel or if you are here at a school level personnel in terms of supporting Tier 2 systems and interventions. And
So
if I was going to say, if somebody could read that for me so that
yeah,
I
we got
don't.
district level, school level, district level, school level, district level, school level. Oh my gosh, it's like every other one. District, couple of school, and a couple of district. It's like
Wonderful. Good. We have a nice mix. And I wanted to just kind of start with that and ask that to get us started, because as we go through today's chat, which is like Betsy mentioned, it is the first in a series of 4. So we really hope that you join us for all 4. But our goal today and through the next several chats is to really think about how we are supporting that Tier 2 system at the school level. And so if you're coming in, maybe you're a district coordinator or a coach, the lens and perspective you take with the chat might be slightly different than if you are at the school level supporting and coaching your school level team with getting with their Tier 2 supports and interventions. All right, so I've got 10:02 on my clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. And as Betsy mentioned, this is our first in a series of chats. Our topic today is getting started with Tier 2 for schools. And what we're hoping to cover with you all today, and what you'll see the focus of this chat series over the next 4 chats, is really focusing in on that role of that Tier 2 systems team to help sustain the practices at that Tier 2 level. But for today, we want to make sure that you're walking away with an understanding of what Tier 2 is within that multi-tiered systems of support for behavior. We hope you'll walk away with some next steps or some to-dos in terms of identifying a team for supporting your Tier 2 implementation, really thinking about what are some of the existing structures on our campus, or what is some of that district guidance that is provided to our schools in terms of that Tier 2 support, and then what are those essential roles. We'll start talking about what data sources that we want to utilize for decision making at Tier 2. We won't go into a deep dive into that topic, because that will be the focus of some of those next chats. But the goal, again, is as we're getting started with developing our Tier 2 systems, what data do we already have available and accessible, and what, dependent on that type of data, what does it tell us in supporting that Tier 2 system within our school campus? And again, what is the guidance that is coming from our district team around use of our data? And then we'll wrap up today's chat really looking at what are some of the interventions that we provide at Tier 2, looking at maybe what are some current things that are on our campus, and then any resources that we might need to start identifying in order to help carry those out. But again, this is going to be a broad overview to get you and your team starting to think about these needs of your Tier 2 system. And then throughout the chat series, you'll learn how to really implement and coach those supports as well. So when we start talking about what is Tier 2 supports? Tier 2 supports refers to both the practices and the systems that are in place that enable us to deliver those targeted interventions to support our students who have not been successful with tier one alone and are at risk for more intensive needs. The goal of supporting students at tier two is really, we want to make sure that we're creating a system that allows us to quickly and efficiently deliver interventions to our students to help prevent that need for more intensive behaviors. So again, when we're talking about tier two supports, we're not talking solely about interventions, but we're talking about the data, the systems, and the practices all together as part of that tier two supplemental support system. So if you've been part of any of our Florida PBIS chats, or you've explored our resources related to tier two in the past, you've probably seen this visual at some point in your review of our resources. And what this visual really does represent, it does give that broad overview of building that tier two behavioral system. And you can even see at the top, we're going to start talking about what that means to have tier one, or ensuring that you have tier one access in as part of your tier two system. But then it'll walk through the idea of what are the data sources and how are we using that data source to apply decision rules for access to tier two supports, and then utilizing that data to help us better group our students by function or by skill, and then align what those students need in terms of their functions of behavior or the skills with interventions that we have available on our campus. And so we really utilize this graphic a lot within our tier two trainings, or as an overview when speaking with district leaders or with school leaders around, do we have these pieces in place? Do we, what does our district policy and procedures around tier two, how does that influence what we're doing at that school level system? Because when we train and when we're coaching tier two practices, we really are training and coaching at that school level system. And so that's really what this graphic is, that broad overview for you to utilize in providing that resource to your school level teams in terms of your system. So let's talk first a little bit about establishing that tier two system, with starting with ensuring we have access to tier one. So I recognize a lot of the names as you guys were all filtering in today, whether you're one of our district coordinators or a school level coach. So hopefully this is pretty familiar to you in terms of what is your tier one system look like. And so these are just 6 of those benchmarks of quality critical elements that we assess and look for to be in place with fidelity. We also have your stakeholder buy-in, the role of your tier one team, your implementation plan, and how you're evaluating effectiveness. But when we think about what our students have access to on our school campus in terms of ensuring the tier one is strong, we really are looking at some of our, what are our expectations and rules? Have they been developed with input from all stakeholders? What does that teaching of those behaviors look like? How are we acknowledging our students for those behaviors? And then that flip side, when we do have the students in appropriate behavior, what does that discipline process look like? Does our consequence system also include opportunities for reteaching so that we can get back into prevention mode? And so I'm posing that question there to our district coordinators and coaches, our school team coaches. How do you know? What are some ways that you are knowing that we have tier one systems and practices in place on your campus? And I'll go ahead and let you guys chat in the chat box. And if one of my colleagues would be so kind to see if anybody answers.
As how do we know when we have tier one practices in place on your campus? Like, what is the evidence that
Yeah.
you would look for?
Yeah, what's that evidence that you're seeing, whether it's formalized or maybe it's more informal? Just how are you assessing right now, looking for strong tier one on your campus?
TFI,
Okay.
data, and expectations are posted throughout the school. Teachers and students are aware of those expectations. PBIS teams are meeting on a regular basis to review data. Thank you, Francine. Carrie Terrell said, review of school-wide discipline data. Christina, oh, it's going fast now. School-wide expectations. David Allen said, examining and sharing on a regular basis the discipline data. Rebecca Schmuck said, at a district level, reviewing referral data for PBIS versus non-PBIS schools. Lakeisha Scott said PBIS walks and reviewing their district's implementation plan. And David Helen, examining and sharing on a regular basis discipline data.
Awesome. So you guys all highlighted, whether it be a formalized data assessment tool like a TFI or a BOQ, whether it's our formalized walkthrough, you're looking at discipline data. So you all kind of hit the high points. So kudos to you, pat yourself on your back. But what I want to just refocus in on is that there's lots of data sources available to you as an active PBIS school to look at your quality of how strong your tier one is. Hopefully, as a school level team, sorry. Hopefully, as a school level team, you're familiar with your school level dashboard report and looking at some of the information that it gives you. It gives you some information around what you see there in the yellow box is your school core effectiveness. This is where you can see is the majority of our students, 80% typically is what we're looking for, that have only 0 to 1 discipline referrals. That kind of lets us know that our tier one is working. But further, dig a little bit deeper, is it not just working across the whole student population, but when we look across our student subgroups, is it being effective across those different subgroups? We also somebody had mentioned fidelity, whether it's through that benchmarks of quality or a walkthrough. We can look at those measures of fidelity to let us know how we're doing with our implementation, and really use some guiding questions around tier one to problem solve if any of these are areas that we need to address before we start working on building that tier two system or identifying students who are in need of tier two. So for example, if we've got core effectiveness is only at 70% of 0 to 1, and we've got a decision rule saying students with 2 or more discipline referrals need to be looked at as needing tier 2 supports, then we've got 30% of our student population that might need tier 2, and that really would overwhelm our system. So we want to provide some guidance in terms of how we're looking at tier one as being effective. And so that resource that you have linked there, that MTSS decision rules, does provide some guidance to consider at that school-wide core effectiveness. I think it says if you've got 80% of students with 0 to 1, you've got good high rates of attendance, then we're in a position where we can start identifying how we're going to develop some clearly defined decision rules for screening and supporting students who are in need of tier 2 supports. That guidance document then provides you some questions to consider across all the tiers, but this is just one of the questions that I wanted to draw your attention to in terms of looking at how we're doing with our tier one. Somebody had mentioned doing some walkthroughs and looking into the individual classrooms. So again, tier one, we're not just only looking at the school-wide implementation plan, but how is our tier one looking when it comes to class-wide PBIS? Are students able to identify what those rules and expectations are in the classroom? Are we doing formalized walkthroughs in the classroom? Maybe part of your PBIS team is doing some peer observations or self-assessments to kind of get a pulse on how fidelity of PBIS implementation is going in the classroom. But again, really just providing you all with some guidelines of things to consider. And these are taken from that MTSS decision rules summary that I shared on the previous slide of things when you're looking at your student data. If we have more than 50% of our school's disciplinary referrals coming from numerous classrooms, we know that we probably need to go back and revisit what does PBIS in the classroom look like at tier 1. But if maybe you've provided some additional supports to a classroom teacher where we've supported them with their classroom implementation, but we're still having one or two students that are still struggling for their behavior to improve despite improvement in the classroom environment, then we know we might have some additional needs centered around tier 2. But again, we're really leading the work at tier 1 to help us have a clearer picture of what is needed at tier 2. All right. So now we're going to start shifting in. We've had our tier 1 access. We're going to start talking about how the pieces of data and selecting interventions intersect with the role of the team within tier 2 systems of support. So we know we need to have our data, whether it's early warning indicator data, screening data, our progress monitoring data at tier 2. It serves the function of informing the team on who needs to access tier 2 supports. What are the practices that are needed, or what are the interventions that are needed at tier 2? And how are we evaluating what we're doing at tier 2? So that's the role of the team, is to really help support the access for tier 2 interventions, help coordinate between tiers 1 and 3, as well as coach the tier 2 practices and evaluate how effective we're doing. And that tier 2 team then also is aligning or selecting interventions, I should say, and supporting interventions that are aligned with our tier 1 access. That second bullet point, meaning that the interventions that we are selecting at tier 2 are accessible and doable, and are really focused on increasing that instruction around life skills and reinforcement of the skills that we are trying to teach. So again, this is just the idea that what data we look at helps inform the team with decisions they make around the use of those interventions. So let's take a quick look at what the team, or who is on the team, and then what are some of those responsibilities. Just like you've probably seen in a lot of our tier 1 supports, we always encourage and promote the engagement with our administrators on our teams. You all know that our administrators are really supportive when it comes to helping build that staff buy-in, but more importantly, they help us identify resources, personnel. For tier 2, it often comes down to time as well to implement interventions. So we always include our administrator on our tier 2 team. But then you can see that the other roles, if you will, are not necessarily tied to a title or personnel position. We need somebody who can serve as that communicator. We need somebody on our team who has that additional content knowledge around tier 2 evidence-based interventions, who understands those legal and ethical guidelines. I'm sorry, I apparently have an auto click on that I'm not aware of. We also need somebody on our team who has not only knowledge of data, but data access. So this is going to be different across schools, perhaps, or even across districts in terms of who has access to the relevant data sources that we need in order to make decisions around tier 2. So I want you to take a quick look at what is listed there as some of the responsibilities of the team, identifying students, matching our students to interventions, helping to group our students, helping to monitor effectiveness of tier 2 interventions. And I want to just get a little feedback from any of you all to maybe describe what you've already seen in terms of how schools are starting to um, build a tier 2 team. Is it a subset of their tier 1 PBIS team? Is it a separate group of individuals with representation on tier 1? What are some of the things that you're seeing in your school or in the schools that you support around the tier 2 team? I'll give it just a minute.
Okay, so Francine, thank you, Francine. For most schools, it seems to be a smaller core group from the PBIS Tier 1 team. I would agree with that. We see that a lot. Amanda Elzy said, subset of the Tier 1 team, adding the school psychologist and counselor to the Tier 2 team.
Okay.
Same. Thank you, Julie.
And I think that goes back to what we were just talking about on the previous slide, where that role and function of that tier 2 team is also to be connected with and collaborate across the tiers. So having that be a subset from that larger tier 1 team, I don't remember who mentioned it, but adding on some key players like a school psychologist, maybe a social worker, maybe you're adding in some ESE personnel to help support at tier 2, I think is really critical when we start thinking about that composition, especially when we start diving into some of the progress monitoring pieces and the implementation of the types of interventions that are needed at your school.
And then one more, Shelby did say that they'd use the entire team for all 3 tiers.
Okay, so you have one unified team that's supporting across the tiers. Excellent. And I've seen some really effective practices where kind of what you all described in terms of a subset of the tier 1 team, where even within that tier 1 PBIS agenda, there's a place that kind of alludes to that decision rule. Like we have 80% of our students with 0 to 1. So maybe at the end of the first 9 weeks or at the end of the month, any student who already has 2 or more office discipline referrals is going to be matched to tier 2 interventions supports. And so kind of that tier 1 team functions as a way to help identify students. And then within a few days or within the next week, that tier 2 subset comes together and then is able to quickly and efficiently match and get that student set up with their interventions. So that smaller team is really responsible, maybe more towards the matching and then monitoring the student progress there as well. So just a couple things to consider as you're starting to build that team is what is the district guidance around who is that school level personnel and what are their roles and responsibilities related to tiered supports. You mentioned adding in someone like a school psychologist or a school social worker. What is the guidance from the district on those roles and responsibilities? Does the district provide clear guidance within various job roles around who and what levels of support certain personnel are able to provide? Another big one, that second bullet point, I really strongly encourage you to consider what are the existing teaming structures that are currently in place at your school that we can embed the work in terms of those roles and responsibilities of the team into those already existing structures. Maybe you already have an MTSS leadership team that is meeting, but hasn't really taken on the responsibility around behavior, but it's all the same people that we need to be sitting with our tier two for behavior supports team. Is there a way that maybe we can align and embed those roles of that team there? And then again, considering itinerant staff, if they need to be part of that team, what do we need to consider? And then what are some other things that you're seeing is needed to be considered within your tier two teaming structures? Or what are some challenges you've experienced with tier two? All right. It looks like we're a little quiet. That's okay. So again, just
Waiting in the
really,
chat.
if anybody says anything, interrupt me, Betsy.
Absolutely.
So again, that tier two team, making sure that it's identified and it fits within that PBIS or your MTSS for behavior structure of your school. Like I said, if you're here to help start building or refining some of your tier two systems, making sure that you're identifying who those people are and what their current role is. And then if you're a district level personnel, working with your school teams to make sure they have the appropriate roles and responsibilities represented in their team as you begin to support them.
So we did
So,
have one response in the chat. Sorry to
yes,
interrupt you,
go
Brooke.
ahead.
So David Allen said scheduling and planning meetings in addition to the other team meetings that members have. So I think that's one of the
Yeah, that's probably a
responsibilities.
barrier.
Yeah.
And I think that that really connects back to when we're starting to build our system, really thinking about what do we currently have in place and doing a little bit of an assessment of what is the role and responsibility of that team and how closely does it align with the function of that tier two um, team for behavior supports. Because often you'll see that there's quite a bit of overlap in those two and probably could have one team functioning in that role to do some of that tier two systems piece.
And then Dama provided some response also. One of her districts provides guidance to the teams on expected team member representation, roles and responsibilities, along with a guidance tool with supporting documents to guide the team. So at that district level, those things are provided to schools to um, help them like identify who should be on that team and what to do.
Dama, I think I might have pulled one of your district examples on my next slide. So here's just some resources and some examples. And Dama, if this is in fact what you're referencing, please let me know. The
Yeah.
resource, first, I want to highlight the tier two resource there up in the top right-hand corner. That's just a meeting guide template for some of the functions of your tier two team. That's a resource that we have available. So maybe you have a team of people that meets that criteria, but you're not 100% sure if it's doing or asking the questions of the tier two system in terms of decision rules, et cetera. Maybe it's focused on an individual student rather than looking at groups of students right now. So you might want to utilize this meeting template to kind of start to identify what are some of the questions that that tier two team needs to be doing to really have that impact on that system's effectiveness. And then I think to Dama's comment around the district providing some guidance, I have an example from Marion County, which I believe was her district, where they're mapping out who on the campus is available to provide supports to students. They've also then mapped it out by intervention. It looks like they've mapped it out as well as by their role on the different teams across the tiers. Love a good resource map. Oh, Betsy, you're muted.
Sorry, just to let folks know, periodically I've been posting a link to the handout for this PowerPoint. So if you wanted to see that resource later on, it's in the chat.
All right. So now we've talked a little bit about setting up and thinking about the role of the team, who is going to be on our tier 2 team to help guide that work. We've talked a little bit about ensuring our students have access to that tier 1, and how that team personnel, again, if it's that subset of the tier 1 PBIS team, how they work together to ensure that we have access. And now the team has to start making some decisions. We have to start looking at some data. So what kind of data do we need? So before we start diving into some of the guidance that we as a project provide, as well as National Center guidance, what data are you all looking at currently to make decisions about access to tier 2 interventions and support? Go ahead and chat that away. All right, I'm going to give you a little cheat sheet for anybody.
Good job, Francine. Office referrals, minor infractions.
Awesome. So these are just some examples of the data sources. You might have additional ones that you look at. I know Betsy mentioned that Francine talked about office discipline referrals. I love that you included the minor infractions in there as well. So things that might be managed in the classroom. Just because behavior is not escalating to the need for an office disciplinary referral doesn't mean that a student doesn't need additional support. So looking at those minor infractions may be a useful tool as well. Our attendance data, we might look at some self-referrals, maybe especially at the secondary level. Are students able to self-identify if they need additional supports? Do we have ways to get parent information or teacher nominations around need for additional supports? With the goal here really being is that the data that we look at is going to help us guide our decisions around who needs tier 2 interventions and supports, and to match that intervention with the needs of our students. So what I would, as you're getting started, one thing that I really encourage you to be doing is really self-reflecting on, not only do we have this data, is it robust enough to make the decisions that we want to make with our students? You know, maybe we just have office disciplinary referrals easily accessible to us to review, but we have really low incidences of behavior. So we're not really identifying very many students in need of discipline through office discipline, or sorry, not in need of discipline, in need of supports through the office disciplinary referral process. So maybe we need to start thinking about how can we broaden our data sources to make sure we're adequately capturing the needs of our students. So again, going back to that role of the team, we want to make sure that there's somebody on your team who not only has access to this data, but understands that data, maybe is proficient with even aggregating some of your data into more comprehensive tools, Excel files for you to make decisions if perhaps your district database doesn't allow for aggregating your data across perhaps like an academic and discipline together at the same time, but that might be something you need in order to make those decisions. So again, I already kind of talked about that. There I go, getting ahead of myself. But making sure that somebody on your team has access to that necessary data. Again, what does your district provide in terms of guidance when using your data for decisions at tier 2? We've seen a lot through whether it be our model school application process, through our TA supports with various districts. Oftentimes, some districts provide just guidance around, students who are not who are struggling with tier one alone would need tier two support. Well, how are we defining struggling? And what we're encouraging your teams to do, to be in line with best practices, is use your existing data, um, look at behavior screening tools if they're available, look at nominations, those data sources together to then set predetermined decision rules so that, again, we can quickly and efficiently identify who needs supports and get them matched up to their interventions without having to take 15 to 20 minutes to individually look at, I'll use myself as an example, Brooke's history of discipline, Brooke's teacher nomination, Brooke's screening results to make decisions. I can look across Brooke, Betsy, Jason, and Dama's data and see that there is a need because we each have multiple disciplinary events. We're at risk on a behavior screener, and our teachers has identified us as needing support with making friends. We can quickly aggregate that data and identify that need. So those predetermined decision rules should hopefully have some quantitative information. They're preset and they help you make those decisions quickly and efficiently. And so again, getting started, what additional data sources might your team need in order to help make those decision rules? All right, so again, our data at tier two serves a couple different functions. What I just talked about, in terms of first at tier two, the role of the team with our data is to identify our students. So we use those existing data sources, those nominations, those screening tools to develop those decision rules, which then helps us identify what are the tier two interventions our students need. Deliver interventions. Now we have to make decisions about how effective those interventions have been. So we're going to evaluate effectiveness of interventions through looking at student progress and intervention fidelity, as well as group progress to determine whether or not we want to continue interventions. So using my little group of me, Betsy, Jason, and Dama, if we're all in a social skills group, and we're not making progress, and all four of us are not making progress with our interventions, we may not make the decision as that tier two team to say, we need to increase intervention support for this group because the whole group's not doing well. Maybe we need to look at the intervention fidelity and make adjustments. But the point here is that our progress monitoring tools that we select at tier two need to be able to give us the information not only for the individual student progress, but the intervention progress as a group and the fidelity as well. Is there a comment, Betsy?
Yeah. Well, Shelby was asking if there were examples of decision rules, but she saw them in the bottom part of that slide circled. But we
Yes.
also do have some other, examples from districts on our website of how they've laid out their decision rules. So I'll try to find those and post them in the chat.
And there's some guidance in that MTSS decision rules summary that is on that first resource that I linked earlier. So you'll have some guidance there. Like Betsy said, we've got some examples available through some of our resources. And then the next chat series, or not the next chat series, I believe it's the one that Jason will be doing on progress monitoring, will be a much more deeper dive into the progress monitoring of decision rules there as well. So when we're selecting tools or when we're thinking about progress monitoring at tier two, we want to make sure that we are able to assess the skills and expectations that we're trying to monitor. So if we're wanting our students to, be respectful, maybe they're frequently talking during class and they're off task, and one of our expectations for tier one is be respectful, and we've got them in on check-in, check-out for that, and we further defined it. That's the behavior we want to be monitoring. We want to get down to that specific skill and expectation in terms of our progress monitoring tool. Our tools should allow us to have changes over time. quick and easy for a teacher or whoever is doing that progress monitoring assessment to identify and assess easily summarized data, and allows us again to have that comparison of progress across students. So as you're thinking, again, the lens of we're either just getting started or we're starting to build our system or getting ready maybe to train around tier 2, what do we currently have in place for assessing tier 2 that meets those features? Are we already using daily report cards, excuse me, behavior report cards? Do we have other assessments? Are we looking at anything around the intervention fidelity? Are we taking attendance for each intervention session? And are we looking at the different components of the intervention being implemented for fidelity? So again, broad strokes right now, you're going to get more of this through the tier 2 chat series, but really thinking about, do we have any of this available to us right now? And if we do have it, then I encourage you to then look at that box of, for the features of the progress monitoring tools, is it doing all of those things that we need it to do? So here's some examples that have recently been taken from some of our gold model school applications. So we can see in this example how they are tracking behavior. They've identified the behavior that they're wanting to increase and decrease. They've identified what the goal is. They have their daily rating, and they even have an opportunity to provide some comments. And they're able to turn that into a quick graph that they could look at. Not only in this particular case, they're looking at an individual student graph, but you could aggregate the student group's data onto one graph and help make decisions across that data as well. And again, they've aligned their progress monitoring not just for their student behavior data, but you can see on that right-hand side, they're also assessing the intervention. The different components are there for check in, check out, around what that morning check-in looks like, how we're using the student's points sheet. You can see how they've planned for what is the planned dosage, 5 sessions per week. I think it's 10 minutes. It's blocked on my screen right now, versus the actual dosage. So as you start thinking about, okay, I want to monitor fidelity. What is it about the fidelity that I want to monitor? We want to make sure that we're building tools that are easily and readily available, that we can quickly get to our teachers, and it's easy to deliver. And so when we think about also that role of the team, yes, there's a little bit of legwork on the front end to set it up, but hopefully as you start to build your system and you have your decision rules in place, you can quickly match your students to an intervention such as check in, check out. When you do that, like in the example that Dama gave, maybe you even already have it defined as, you know, Miss Curtis is going to be the check-in, check-out facilitator, and we already have our progress monitoring tools readily available to give out to our teachers and staff. All right, so the last piece of getting ready to get started is we need to have an idea of what interventions are available to our students. So I already talked a little bit and mentioned check in, check out with that example, but what are some other interventions that you're using at tier 2 on your school campuses, or that you know schools are using on your campus if you're a district support? Go ahead and chat those out.
Small group, check in, check out. Let's see if there's any others. Small group counseling, mentoring groups.
All right,
Second step, used in small group.
beautiful.
Check in, check out. And then Shelby asked, do you consider counseling referrals tier 2 or 3 if it is individual?
I would probably think that individualized counseling sounds like it's going to fall in that tier 3 bucket. And I think it really also could be utilized in conjunction with some tier 2 supports. So maybe they're getting individualized counseling, just related to some anger management or something like that. And maybe they're then involved with a check-in, check-out for using a cool down strategy or something like that, that they may have been taught through some additional supports. But typically individualized, where they're really focusing in on that individual student needs, is typically going to fall into a tier 3 bucket. But what I want to say that I was going to point out, that what I heard when Betsy was reading out the chat box for me, that I was going to say, pat yourself on your back, round of applause. Lots of talk about that group. At tier 2, we are typically talking about interventions that are going to be delivered to groups of students. So some features of those interventions is that we want to make sure that they are readily available based on student need. We're not having to build an intervention package for an individual, or even maybe even a small group of individuals, on the fly. We want interventions that are readily available. Hopefully we've identified interventions that could be easily implemented by teachers and staff, but allow for some flexibility based on our student needs, and aligned with those expectations. And I want to draw your attention to those 3 bullet points on there, because I heard somebody say like small group, which, if that small group is focused on providing that increased instruction and practice of a skill, and that small group is providing that increased feedback or increased opportunities for reinforcement and increasing the structure of behavior supports, then we're starting to look like that tier 2 intervention. But if we just have it defined as small group, we don't really provide a lot of clarity around what's being delivered in that small group. Small group to me is a method of delivering an intervention. So it's what you're doing during that small group that is that intervention piece. And I'm sure that's what you meant with, in terms of like social skills small groups or small group counseling, things of that nature. But we really want to focus in, are we selecting interventions that allow for that increased practice, that increased feedback, and that increased structure? And so, again, as we start thinking about what interventions are already on place, are already happening on your campus with regard to tier 2 and supporting those behavioral skills, do we have the resource personnel available to deliver those interventions, or what are the expectations? Does our district provide that guidance around tier 2 interventions? Maybe your district has guidance around evidence-based interventions that are available at all of the campuses. In fact, I want to ask that question. How many of you are in districts where there is a district guidance around selected evidence-based interventions that are available for your school?
And while you guys are answering that question in the chat of whether the district provides any guidance on resources to use at tier 2, we did have one other question from the last time about fidelity. So if the students in tier 2 are using point sheets for their check-in, check-out with their mentor, Francine wanted to know if the signature on the bottom that the mentor provides, would that count as fidelity of that intervention? So I just wanted to get your take on that.
So Francine, I think if you're talking about at the end of the day, they signed the point sheet, that alone, a single use of it, doesn't give us much in terms of fidelity. But the answer, yes, it does let us know just enough in terms of maybe dosage. So, but only if you know how much they're supposed to have received. So for example, if you're supposed to have 30 check-ins and we have 20 signatures, that gives us information about dosage. But if you just handed us 5 point sheets with 5 signatures, it doesn't allow us to make that same assessment in terms of dosage. It's just letting us know they did 5 check-ins. We don't know if that was how much they were supposed to get, right? So you need to kind of have that both pieces of how much are we supposed to get and how much did we actually deliver um, on that piece.
And Brooke, I really loved that page that you showed earlier with that fidelity illustration. It was on the same page as the progress monitoring. If you're looking in the handouts, I think that gives a really good comprehensive look at fidelity. And you have a lot of responses to your last question. So if you're
Okay.
ready, I'll start reading
Yeah,
those.
go ahead.
So Tara Hatch in Lake said that they do provide guidance around tier 2. Christina, our district has selected evidence-based curriculum for schools to use. Rebecca Fletcher said our district is working on our guidance for schools regarding tier 2, so it's in the works. Rebecca Schmuck from Santa Rosa said they have a SharePoint with resources available for intervention and provide monthly Teams forums on the intervention. And you're welcome, Francine. And Lakeisha says our district has developed a Canvas course that provides guidance for schools.
Awesome. So I don't know in that Canvas course what's covered, but I think I want to kind of use that as an example for the ideas like when we identify tier 2 interventions that we want to use and deliver, how are we training and coaching the support for those interventions? So we've used the example of check-in, check-out as that school level tier 2 team. How are we making sure that our teachers are adequate, going through that checkout process or scoring and giving the feedback, using the sentence starters and doing that in the fidelity of the intervention, all the pieces, or are they literally just at the end of the day giving the point sheets without giving the feedback and not doing the instruction around the skills that they need? So I would be really curious and interested to see, if your district's providing you guidance on interventions, what does that training and support look like for those evidence-based interventions? So if you're a district coordinator and coach, how, are you involved in that at all? Things like that. So again, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I want to focus on the idea of if we're getting started, if we know we've got 2 or 3 interventions that our district has provided us clear guidance that are evidence-based that we should be using at tier 2, then we can do a quick assessment of, do we need to make sure we have everybody on our campus that, do we have personnel that can support it? Do we have any training needs around it and things like that? So again, this is more of like a quick little check of what do we have, what that meets that bill of those tier 2 interventions, and how do we then build up and train and coach what we already have. Hopefully either through this chat series or as you start maybe engaging more with our project around training and coaching, maybe there's some additional needs that you all might identify as needed for your tier 2 interventions. So here's some of the examples. I heard a couple people mention some of these in the chat. Maybe we're doing the behavior education program, check in, check out. Maybe for that small group instruction, we're using curriculums like a skill streaming. I think I heard second step or I can problem solve. So these are just some examples. So again, I had you share out. So for maybe those of you who are joining, going, I have no idea what we're talking about in tier 2 interventions, but I've heard our school or district talk about skill streaming. We can use that. Now it would be a great opportunity for you to go back and kind of look at what are some guidance that you might have or some, like I said, training or coaching needs around the use of those interventions. And so again, just couple things to keep in mind, additional groups that might be needed. Maybe you're using your school counselors or school social workers to help identify different groups for support groups for grief. Maybe you're working with some of your behavior specialists or behavior analyst and psychologist on some self-monitoring things to work with our students. But I want to focus, draw your attention to the handout that we have. So I kind of talked through a little bit around how to select or things to consider when selecting interventions. This is a nice handout that kind of summarizes what are the best interventions to have around tier two. So I highlighted some of those key practices in terms of providing that additional instruction, the additional feedback, the additional structure, and this just gives a little bit more guidance if you don't have any evidence-based interventions currently being utilized for tier two, how to maybe start identifying resources that you might want to use. All right, so we're almost at the end of the chat and having some opportunities to answer any questions you might have. Again, I know I gave you a lot of information and very broadly, and it's really just hopefully walking away with the role of the team and what are some next steps maybe that our team needs to do in terms of looking at our tier one, looking at our data, looking at what interventions we have available, because our next upcoming coaching chats will really go into a much more deeper dive in terms of establishing that screening system. So that's coming up on Tuesday, October 15th. I believe Dama is participating with that chat, and Kat and Nicole. If you've been with our project before, though you recognize those names, but they'll be doing a deeper dive on how to establish your screening system for tier two supports. Then I believe we have Betsy and Jonathan, who will be supporting the November 12th tier two chat on matching your tier two interventions to student needs, so that selecting some standard protocol interventions and matching. And then we will wrap up the series with evaluating progress monitoring and evaluating response to tier two. And that'll be with Jason in February. We also have some additional supports, maybe maybe this was all a complete review for you and you need some more guidance on really problem solving your tier two system. We do have some online modules. If you want to look at any of the different areas we talked about, we also have our tier two resources live binder. And then if you're sitting here going, you know what, I think I'd rather maybe see what it would look like to get trained by Florida PBIS in some of these practices, meet with your district coordinators to start identifying any next steps maybe around those supports as well. So I'm going to leave the last 5 minutes or so